It was a quiet Sunday evening, and I found myself alone in my apartment. The kind of evening that pulls you into a reflective mood, urging you to sift through memories of a past you've never fully explored. In my case, this led to a dusty cardboard box tucked away in the corner of my closet. Inside were relics of my family's history, mostly old photographs and videotapes that hadn't been touched in years. Among them, I found a tape labeled in my father's unmistakable scrawl, "Wedding Day, June 15th, 1998. Curiosity got the better of me. My parents, Claire and Robert, had always spoken about their wedding day with a kind of reverence. It was the perfect day, they said. The weather was ideal, the ceremony magical, and the reception full of joy. But stories could never quite capture the reality. With a mix of nostalgia and intrigue, I dusted off the old VHS player and set it up in my living room. The TV flickered to life, and soon, grainy footage of a sunny June afternoon filled the screen. The video began with a sweeping shot of the outdoor venue. Rows of white chairs lined with lilacs stretched across a lush green lawn. Guests were dressed in bright, cheerful colors, their faces glowing with smiles and laughter. Then the camera focused on the bride, my mother. She looked radiant, her long brown hair falling in elegant curls, her white dress flowing like a dream. My father stood nervously at the altar, his hands fidgeting until she appeared. His expression transformed, his face alight with an emotion so pure it almost made me forget he was gone. For a while, I was lost in the beauty of the scene. But as I continued watching, a peculiar detail caught my attention. Seated in the last row was a man I didn't recognize. He was partially obscured by the tall guest in front of him, but his presence was unmistakable. Unlike everyone else, he wasn't smiling or clapping. His face was unervingly blank, and his eyes seemed to pierce straight through the camera lens, almost as if he knew someone would notice him years later. A chill ran down my spine. I rewound the tape, convinced I had imagined it. But there he was again. Same dark suit, same emotionless stare. Something about him felt off. He didn't belong there, not among the joyful faces surrounding him. As I continued watching, his presence began to unsettle me more. My parents exchanged vows, kissed, and walked down the aisle to a chorus of applause. Yet the man remained still, as though he were separate from the celebration, an intruder in a sacred moment. Then came the reception. The atmosphere was lively, full of laughter and dancing. My father delivered a heartfelt toast, and my mother's laughter rang out like a bell. It should have been the perfect ending to the perfect day. But the mysterious man appeared again. This time he wasn't sitting. He was standing off to the side, in the shadows, watching. My mother crossed the frame and stopped near him. Their interaction was brief but peculiar. They didn't seem to be exchanging pleasantries. My mother's posture was tense, her eyes darting around as though to ensure no one was watching. When she turned back toward the party, her smile returned, but it looked strained, as though it were a mask she had hastily put on. I felt a knot forming in my stomach. This man wasn't just some random guest. He knew my mother, and whatever they discussed wasn't meant for anyone else to hear. I paused the video and stared at the frozen image of her face. It was a look I had never seen before, a mixture of fear and resolve. Questions swirled in my mind, each more troubling than the last. Who was he? What was his connection to my parents? And why had I never heard about him? As I continued watching, the rest of the tape seemed unremarkable. The guests danced, the cake was cut, and the newlyweds shared their first dance as husband and wife. The mysterious man had disappeared by then, leaving only an unsettling memory in his wake. The video ended, and the screen went black, but I sat there for a long time, unable to move. Something about that man and the way my mother interacted with him didn't sit right with me. I spent the night replaying the events of the video in my mind. The wedding was supposed to be a celebration of love and unity, yet this man's presence felt like a blemish, a hidden crack in the foundation of my parents' story. My father was no longer around to offer clarity. He had passed away 2 years earlier, a sudden heart attack that left us all reeling. My mother, however, was still very much alive. But the thought of confronting her about this, about something that seemed so deeply buried in the past, filled me with dread. I couldn't shake the feeling that this man was a key to a secret my parents had kept from me. A part of me wanted to let it go, to pretend I hadn't seen him. But another part, the part that craved the truth, wouldn't allow me to. Whatever this was, it had been hidden for too long. And if there was one thing I had learned from my father's sudden death, it was that life was too short for unanswered questions. The discovery of the mysterious man at my parents' wedding haunted me for days. I couldn't shake the image of his cold stare or the cryptic exchange with my mother. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him in the back row, disconnected from the joy around him, his presence an anomaly in an otherwise perfect day. My curiosity turned into obsession. I needed answers, and I wasn't going to wait for them to come to me. I started my investigation with the obvious place: my parents' house. My mom still lived there, but she spent most of her time at her gardening club or volunteering. One afternoon, while she was out, I let myself in using the spare key she had given me. I wasn't proud of snooping, but I convinced myself it was for a good reason. I had to know the truth. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that amplifies your every breath and movement. I headed straight for the attic, where my parents stored boxes of old documents, photographs, and memorabilia. It was dusty and cramped, the slanted ceiling forcing me to crouch as I sifted through piles of forgotten relics. Most of it was innocuous: holiday decorations, childhood drawings, and yellowed newspaper clippings. But then I found a box labeled "Wedding" in bold black marker. Inside were stacks of photos, programs, and other mementos from their big day. I combed through them with a mix of anticipation and dread, searching for any sign of the man. The photos were filled with happy faces, couples dancing, and candid moments of joy. But in one picture, taken during the ceremony, I saw him again. He was seated in the same spot as in the video, his expression just as blank and unfeeling. A shiver ran down my spine. Beneath the photos was a small envelope, yellowed with age. Inside was a handwritten letter addressed to my mother. The handwriting wasn't my father's. My hands shook as I unfolded the paper and read the words scrawled across it. The letter was cryptic but unmistakably personal. The man spoke of love, regret, and secrets that couldn't stay hidden forever. He mentioned my mother by name, and the tone was intimate in a way that made my stomach churn. Who was this man, and what kind of history did he share with my mother? I didn't have time to dwell on it. As I placed the letter back in the envelope, I heard the sound of the front door opening. My heart leaped into my throat. My mom was home. Panic set in as I scrambled to put everything back the way I found it. I shoved the box back into its corner, dust flying everywhere, and hurried down the attic ladder. By the time I reached the living room, she was already calling out for me. I played it cool, acting as though I had just stopped by to grab a book I had left behind. She didn't seem suspicious, but the guilt gnawed at me. I couldn't confront her, not yet. I needed more proof, more pieces of the puzzle before I accused her of keeping such a monumental secret. Later that night, unable to sleep, I decided to take my search online. I scanned every frame of the wedding video, capturing a clear still of the man's face. Using reverse image searches and social media sleuthing, I hoped to find even a trace of his identity. Hours passed with no luck. It was like he didn't exist. Frustrated but determined, I posted his image anonymously on a forum dedicated to solving mysteries. The responses came quickly, but none were helpful. Some joked that he looked like a ghost. Others suggested he might be an uninvited guest. Then a private message arrived. It was from a user with no profile picture and a username that consisted of random numbers. The message was short: "I know who he is. Be careful." My pulse quickened as I typed back, asking for more information. Minutes felt like hours as I waited for a response. When it finally came, it contained an address and a time. No explanation, no name. Just coordinates that pointed to a location about an hour outside of town. It was reckless to even consider going, but I couldn't ignore it. This was the first lead I'd gotten, and I wasn't about to let it slip through my fingers. The next evening, I found myself driving down a desolate road, the setting sun casting long shadows across the landscape. The address led to an abandoned building, its windows shattered and walls covered in graffiti. It looked like the kind of place you'd see in a horror movie, but I pushed past my fear and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and the faint smell of mildew. My footsteps echoed as I navigated the dark, empty halls. In one of the rooms I found a man waiting. He was older than the one in the video but unmistakably the same person. His face had aged, but those cold, piercing eyes hadn't changed. He didn't look surprised to see me. If anything, he seemed to have been expecting this meeting. Before I could say a word, he spoke. His voice was calm but carried an edge of menace. He knew who I was. He knew about the video. And, most disturbingly, he knew things about my parents that I didn't. He told me that my father had secrets, ones that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my family. He claimed my mother wasn't the woman I believed her to be. Then, without warning, he handed me an envelope and walked away. Inside was a single photograph. It showed my parents, younger and smiling, but they weren't alone. The man was there too, standing beside them as if he belonged. My world tilted as I realized the implications. This wasn't just a stranger from the wedding. This man was part of their lives, a part they had gone to great lengths to erase. I left the building shaken and full of questions. As I drove home, the photograph sat on the passenger seat, a silent reminder that my quest for the truth was far from over. Whatever lay ahead, I knew one thing for certain. The past wasn't as buried as my parents had hoped. The drive back from the abandoned building was suffocating. The photograph sat on the passenger seat, its edges curled and worn from years of secrecy. My thoughts churned like a storm, the image of my parents standing beside the man haunting me. They had smiled, seemingly unaware of the dark threads weaving through their lives. Yet the man's presence in the photo felt like a betrayal, a crack in the polished facade of my family's story. Sleep evaded me that night. I kept replaying the events of the day, trying to make sense of the connection between the stranger and my parents. The letter, the photograph, the cryptic warnings, they all pointed to a truth I wasn't sure I was ready to face. As dawn broke, the soft light filtering through my blinds felt more like an intrusion than a comfort. My life, once steady and predictable, was unraveling, and I had no choice but to follow the thread. Determined to uncover more, I returned to the wedding video. I scrutinized every frame, searching for overlooked details. There was something about the way my mother had interacted with the man that bothered me. Her body language was tense, her movements guarded. It was clear she had recognized him, but the nature of their relationship remained a mystery. I began to wonder if my father had known about him. The idea that their marriage, the foundation of our family, had been built on lies was almost too much to bear. I spent the next few days combing through records and archives, using every resource I could think of. My search led me to a public library, where I scoured old newspapers and local event logs. It was tedious work, but persistence paid off. I found an article from the late 1990s about a scandal involving a man whose description matched the one from the wedding. He had been implicated in a series of financial schemes, leaving a trail of ruined lives in his wake. His name was mentioned, and it sent a chill down my spine. Michael Hayes. The name meant nothing to me, but the implications were clear. This man had a history of deception, and now he was tied to my family. Armed with this new information, I turned my attention to my mother. She was the only one left who could provide answers, but confronting her felt impossible. She had always been a pillar of strength and warmth, the kind of person who made everyone feel safe. Yet now, I couldn't shake the suspicion that she had been hiding something all along. The thought of her keeping secrets from me was like a splinter lodged deep in my chest, painful and persistent. I began to observe her more closely, looking for signs of guilt or unease. She went about her days as she always had, tending to her garden, chatting with neighbors, and volunteering at the community center. But now every smile, every laugh, felt like a performance. I caught myself questioning even the most innocent gestures, a paranoia that began to consume me. Desperate for clarity, I decided to investigate further into Michael Hayes. I tracked down public records, piecing together fragments of his life. He had been married once, briefly, but there were no children or close family ties. His financial crimes had led to a prison sentence, but he had been released years before my parents' wedding. After that, he seemed to disappear, his name fading into obscurity. The lack of information only deepened the mystery. How had he ended up at my parents' wedding, and what connection did he have to them? One night, as I stared at the photograph for the 100th time, I noticed something I hadn't before. The man was wearing a distinctive lapel pin, a small emblem shaped like a compass. It seemed insignificant at first, but the detail nagged at me. I searched online, hoping to find its meaning. After hours of digging, I discovered that the pin was associated with an exclusive club, a group known for its secrecy and influence in high society. The realization sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. This wasn't just about family secrets. It was something much larger. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was far from clear. My parents had always seemed so ordinary, their lives rooted in love and routine. Yet now, it appeared they had been entangled in something far beyond my understanding. The weight of it all pressed down on me, a suffocating mix of confusion and dread. Unable to resist the pull of the truth, I decided to dig deeper into the club. Membership records were inaccessible to the public, but I found whispers of its influence online. The group was known for its ties to powerful figures, from politicians to business magnates. The compass emblem was a symbol of guidance and control, a reminder of the group's reach. It was a world far removed from my own, yet somehow my parents had been a part of it. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It started as a vague unease, a sense of eyes on me when I was alone. Then, small incidents began to pile up. A car parked too long outside my apartment, a stranger lingering in a coffee shop. My paranoia grew, but I couldn't afford to back down. Whoever was behind this wanted me to stop digging, but I was too far gone to turn back. One evening, while reviewing my notes, my phone buzzed with an anonymous message. It contained no words, just a single image. The compass emblem, stark and menacing against a black background. The message was clear. I was treading dangerous ground, and someone wanted me to know it. Fear gripped me, but it was too late to stop. The secrets surrounding Michael Hayes and my family were too important to leave buried. Whatever lay at the end of this path, I had to see it through. The truth, no matter how dark, was the only way to reclaim the life I thought I knew. The anonymous message was a warning, but it only solidified my resolve. Whoever had sent it wanted to scare me, to deter me from continuing my search for the truth. But I couldn't stop now, not when I was so close to uncovering the tangled web that connected my parents to Michael Hayes and his shadowy world. My life had already been turned upside down, and the only way forward was to dive deeper. The next day, I decided to visit my father's old office. He had passed away years ago, but the building where he worked still stood, an unassuming structure on the outskirts of the city. I hoped to find something, anything, that might shed light on his connection to Hayes. The office was now occupied by a new tenant, but I managed to convince the building's maintenance staff to let me into the archives. I explained that I was researching my father's career, a half-truth that didn't seem to raise any alarms. The archive room was a cold, dimly lit space filled with rows of metal filing cabinets. Dust motes floated in the stale air as I began my search. I combed through old documents, project files, and client lists, my heart pounding with every page I turned. Most of it was mundane, detailing routine business operations. But then I found a folder labeled Private. The label alone sent a thrill of anticipation through me. Inside were a series of contracts and correspondence, all tied to a company I had never heard of, Meridian Holdings. The documents were vague, filled with legal jargon and ambiguous terms. But one name appeared repeatedly, Michael Hayes. My father had been working with him, possibly even for him. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. My father, the man I had idolized as a pillar of integrity, had been involved in something secretive and potentially dangerous. One letter stood out. It was written in my father's handwriting and addressed to someone named Evelyn, my mother. The tone was urgent, almost desperate. He mentioned protecting the family, and severing ties with Meridian Holdings. There was no explanation, just a sense of urgency and fear. I tucked the letter into my bag, unable to process what it meant just yet. As I left the building, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. A car idled across the street, its engine running but its driver obscured by tinted windows. I kept my head down and walked briskly to my car, my pulse racing. Once inside, I locked the doors and checked my rearview mirror. The car didn't follow me, but the unease lingered. Back home, I spread the documents across my desk, trying to piece together the fragments of the story. My father had been connected to Michael Hayes through Meridian Holdings, a company that seemed to operate in the shadows. The compass emblem appeared on several of the documents, confirming its link to the mysterious club. But what did it all mean? And why had my parents kept this part of their lives hidden from me? I turned my attention to the letter addressed to my mother. The phrase severing ties suggested that my father had wanted out. But from what? Had he discovered something about Hayes or Meridian Holdings that made him reconsider his involvement? Or had he been forced to walk away to protect us? The questions multiplied, each one more unsettling than the last. The following morning, I received another message. This time, it wasn't anonymous. It came from a lawyer representing Meridian Holdings. The email was polite but firm, requesting a meeting to discuss sensitive matters related to my recent inquiries. The tone was professional, but the underlying message was clear. They knew what I was doing, and they wanted to control the narrative. I debated whether to accept the meeting. On one hand, it could be a trap, a way to silence me or dissuade me from digging further. On the other hand, it might provide the answers I so desperately needed. After hours of deliberation, I decided to go. I couldn't let fear dictate my actions, not when I was so close to the truth. The meeting was scheduled at a high-rise office building in the heart of the city. The sleek, modern design of the space felt sterile, almost oppressive. I was escorted to a conference room on the top floor, where a man in a tailored suit greeted me. He introduced himself as Thomas Green, a senior advisor for Meridian Holdings. His demeanor was calm, almost unnervingly so. Green began by acknowledging my father's past involvement with the company. He spoke in vague terms, emphasizing the complexities of their operations and the sensitive nature of their work. When I pressed him for specifics, he sidestepped my questions, redirecting the conversation to my recent activities. He made it clear that my inquiries were being monitored and strongly advised me to reconsider pursuing the matter further. As the meeting ended, Green handed me a file. He claimed it contained everything I needed to know about my father's involvement with Meridian Holdings. But as I left the building, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been fed a carefully curated version of the truth. At home, I opened the file with trembling hands. It contained reports, financial records, and memos, all painting a picture of a legitimate business. But beneath the surface, there were hints of something darker. Projects labeled confidential with no details provided. Payments to shell companies. Correspondence with individuals known for their involvement in illicit activities. It was clear that Meridian Holdings operated in the gray areas of morality and legality. One document stood out. It was a termination agreement signed by my father, formally severing his ties with the company. The date matched the timeline of the letter he had written to my mother. It seemed he had tried to walk away, but at what cost? The file raised more questions than it answered, and I knew I couldn't stop now. The truth was within reach, and I was determined to uncover it, no matter the risk. The deeper I delved into my father's secret life, the more I realized how much of our reality had been built on lies and omissions. The letter, the documents from Meridian Holdings, the mysterious man at the wedding, they all pointed to a dark undercurrent that I could no longer ignore. My father's decision to sever ties with the company felt like a desperate attempt to protect me and my mother, but the question remained. From what? The document I had received from Thomas Green had only served to deepen the mystery. The vague references to confidential projects and shady financial transactions suggested that Meridian Holdings had been more than just a business. It seemed to operate in a realm that was far outside the law, possibly engaged in activities that were both morally and legally questionable. And my father, despite all his efforts to distance himself, had been deeply embedded in it. I wondered if the man at the wedding, Michael Hayes, had been more than just a guest. Had he been the one who pulled my father back in? Or had my father unknowingly dragged my mother into the world of Meridian Holdings when they got married? As the days passed, my obsession only grew. I began questioning every part of my childhood, looking for clues that had once seemed innocuous but now felt like hidden signs. I noticed the way my father had been unusually protective of our family, shielding us from certain discussions, locking up financial documents and correspondence in places I had never dared to look. It was as if he had been preparing for something, but I hadn't known it at the time. In my search for answers, I reached out to people who might have known something about my father's past. I contacted his old colleagues, but most of them were either unaware of his dealings with Meridian Holdings or too afraid to talk. It wasn't long before I realized that fear had surrounded my father's association with the company, the kind of fear that compelled people to keep quiet, even about the most innocuous of details. One afternoon, as I was going through yet another stack of old letters, I received a phone call. The voice on the other end was familiar but strained. It was my mother. I hadn't heard from her in a few days, and the tension in her voice was palpable. She asked me to come over urgently. Her tone left no room for argument. Something had changed, and I knew I had to go. When I arrived at her house, I found her sitting at the kitchen table, her hands trembling as she held a letter. Her face was pale, and her eyes were red from crying. Without saying a word, she handed me the letter. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was from Michael Hayes. The words were direct and unsettling. "I know what you've been looking for, Claire. If you value your son's safety, you will stop. This is your last warning." A chill ran through me as I read the words. It was clear that Hayes had been monitoring my every move. But what frightened me more was the implication. Hayes didn't just know about my search, he knew everything about my family. He knew my weaknesses, my desires for the truth, and he was willing to use them against me. I looked up at my mother, her face a mask of fear and guilt. "Mom," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "What's going on? What is this? What does Michael Hayes want from us?" She hesitated, her gaze flickering to the envelope as though it held the answers I had been seeking. Then, with a long sigh, she spoke. Her voice was soft but heavy with the weight of years of silence. "I was trying to protect you," she said. "I was trying to keep you safe from all of this. But now I see you've uncovered the truth." She paused, gathering herself before continuing. "Michael Hayes wasn't just a guest at our wedding. He was a part of our lives long before that. Your father and I met him when we were young, during a time when we were both drawn into a world that we couldn't fully escape. Meridian Holdings was never just a business to your father. It was a life, one he couldn't entirely break away from. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture still seemed incomplete." My mother's eyes were filled with sorrow, but there was also a strange sense of resignation. She had known something she had kept from me all these years. "Your father tried to protect us. He tried to sever his ties with Hayes and the company, but they don't let people go so easily. They threatened us. They controlled him. And when he died, I thought maybe we'd be free. But we're not, are we?" I said, my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me. She shook her head. "No, we're not. Michael Hayes is still out there, and he's not going to stop until he gets what he wants. He thinks you're a threat to him, to the secrets he's worked so hard to bury. That's why he's been watching you." I felt a surge of anger and helplessness. My mother, my father, they had been caught in something much larger than I had ever imagined. The truth was far darker than I had expected, and I wasn't sure if I had the strength to keep going. "Do you know what he wants?" I asked, my voice barely audible. She looked at me, her face pale but resolute. "He wants control. He wants the legacy your father tried to leave behind, and he believes you are the key to that. You're his next target." The words hit me like a blow to the chest. Michael Hayes had been part of my parents' world, a world I had never known. Now he was dragging me into it, pulling me into the very same darkness that had consumed them. I had no choice but to fight back, to protect myself and my mother from the forces that had been controlling our lives for so long. But I knew I couldn't do it alone. I needed help. I needed to find a way to confront Hayes and the secrets he had buried. The truth, no matter how dangerous, was the only weapon I had left. And so, with my mother's warning still echoing in my mind, I made a decision. I would face Michael Hayes, uncover the full extent of the conspiracy, and finally take back control of my life. The road ahead would be treacherous, but I had come too far to turn back now. The secrets had been buried for too long, and it was time to expose them for good. The weight of the file I held was heavier than it seemed. The pages inside were filled with documents that looked like standard corporate files. Balance sheets, contracts, and project reports. Yet they revealed something much darker. The name of the company, Meridian Holdings, loomed over everything, and at the heart of it, something even more disturbing began to emerge. I had been following the trail left behind by Thomas Green, a trail that led me back to the company my father had once been part of, a company he had publicly distanced himself from years ago. But why? What had prompted his sudden withdrawal? And why had he left such a complex web of connections behind? The more I dug into the records, the more I felt like an intruder in a world I had never known. A world where business decisions intertwined with power, control, and something far more dangerous. The documents led me to a realization that gnawed at my mind. My parents had been part of something I couldn't yet comprehend, something far more complicated and dark than I had ever imagined. The financial reports, which once seemed mundane, were now riddled with inconsistencies. Transactions that didn't match up, partnerships that seemed out of place, and hidden accounts that suggested large sums of money being funneled into mysterious operations. It all pointed to a secret agenda that had been running parallel to the life I had known. But it was the photographs that truly unsettled me. The old wedding picture of my parents, so carefully preserved in a worn album, began to take on an entirely different significance. In it, my mother's smile seemed forced, and my father's gaze was distant, almost calculating. There was a certain coldness in his eyes, a look I had never seen before. As a child, I had always thought of him as a pillar of strength, but now I wasn't so sure. My mother, too, had always seemed a bit too perfect, too composed. Perhaps that was the way she had been trained to be, or perhaps it was a mask she had worn for years. There was one document, however, that stood out the most. It wasn't just a financial statement or a contract, but rather a personal letter between my father and Michael Hayes, the CEO of Meridian Holdings. It was dated shortly before my father's departure from the company. The letter was brief but chilling. It hinted at a larger conspiracy, one involving powerful people who were willing to go to great lengths to protect their interests. It mentioned names I had never heard before, and connections that seemed impossible to break. The letter ended with a warning. For the sake of the family, you must let go. The path ahead is dangerous. The implications of that letter were staggering. If my father had known about a plot so vast, so dangerous, why hadn't he told anyone? Why hadn't he warned me? The weight of the unanswered questions grew heavier with each page I turned. My father had always been secretive, but this level of deception, this level of silence, was something I hadn't expected. As the pieces of the puzzle began to come together, I realized that I was no longer just searching for answers about my parents. I was searching for the truth about who I was, about the legacy they had left me, and about the world they had tried to shield me from. Every document, every photograph, every letter pointed to a reality I wasn't ready to face. But now there was no turning back. The more I uncovered, the deeper I was pulled into a world of secrets, lies, and betrayal. The truth had begun to reveal itself in fragments, and I could no longer ignore it. What had started as a simple curiosity about my family's past had now become a dangerous journey, one that would lead me into the heart of a conspiracy much larger than I had ever imagined. And I had no idea where it would take me next.